Thank you for tuning into this video discussion of the FRQ Friday. We're on the third FRQ Friday. This one is about an argumentative essay. What I've given you is a little bit of a scenario, a little bit of background, which some argumentative essays can certainly have. It's about the financial crisis in 2008, the Great Recession, and you have to decide if Congress is making this Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. They're making it very difficult to remove the heads of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. So the executive branch, the president, has difficulty doing that. And the prompt once again was, did Congress creation of an agency head who cannot be removed by the president for 5 years except for cause violate the constitutional principle of checks and balances? So, I mean, this is a tough question, and I don't think that there is an easy path with this argumentative essay. So right away, I just jotted down essentially the prompt. I chose a side, and it didn't really matter which side because both sides were kind of equally difficult. This is not an easy prompt at all, and I argued that it did violate the constitutional principle of checks and balances. You could easily argue it the other way. And, well, not easy, but you could just switch it up and go the other way. If you are faced with a prompt on the big day on May 11th that you are completely confused by, or it looks very, very difficult, I would just pick a side. There's no use in thinking about it for a really, really long amount of time. You need to pick a side for your argumentative essays to move forward. So here I picked a side right away. I picked that it's a violation of checks and balances. I put because, and the first thing I did is I thought up a reason why. So I thought up a reason why immediately, and my reason was because the president needs the power to maintain its chief executive role. So I wrote that as my second half of the prompt, figuring that I'd get something else for my first half of the prompt of the claim. So I wrote that, I wrote the word and I wrote because blah, 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 blah. And I left this area blank to start with. So here I was with just because the president needs his power to maintain the role of chief executive. And I explained then how difficult it is to manage the bureaucracy. I explained how bureaucracy uses discretion and they may ignore policy initiatives from the heads of their bureaucratic agency, and how the president needs to be able to wield some sort of power over agencies and departments to make sure that things get done, because he's in charge of making sure the laws are executed. So without that, you could have a tyranny of the bureaucracy. The president's not able to check his own branch, not able to manage his own branch, and that's interfering with the balance of power in the United States. So I made an argument in my second paragraph here that this was throwing off the balance where bureaucracy could be unable to be controlled, and that's weakening the power of the president and strengthening the power of the bureaucracy, creating potentially a tyranny of the bureaucracy. So there, I think I made some good points. I did not use a foundational document in this group. I used my own knowledge of bureaucracy in the executive branch. Then I went back and I decided to target the entire concept of checks and balances. And I was thinking about Fed 51 and how Fed 51 talks a lot about separation of powers, and separation of powers as the foundation of checks and balances. That you can't really have checks and balances unless you have clear areas of separation of powers, and you have it so each branch can't really take away the other branch's powers, but they can restrict each other. So I chose to talk about how Fed 51, Madison was afraid of a tyranny of the executive or legislative branches, and he explained that separation of powers would lead to the ability of them to check each other, to prevent each other from getting too powerful, that it prevented any tyranny of the executive or tyranny of the legislative. So I made the case that this action from the legislature is using their lawmaking power to strip away some of the basic executive powers of the executive branch. If the executive branch can't choose how to execute the laws and how to implement the laws, then what powers do they actually have? And you know that's one of their main powers. That it says that the president executes the laws, that they are the executor of the laws, and that means that they're supposed to choose how to implement things. And if Congress is basically saying you can't do things the way you're supposed to, you can't manage the departments and agencies to make sure the law is being executed, they're basically stripping away one of the most basic powers the Constitution provides. So I made a case for that, and using Fed 51 a little bit as kind of the starting point in my essay. Now, certainly I feel like, looking at it again right now, I could certainly add a few more things to this essay. I kind of wish I could make a refutation, because we could certainly talk about the other side. If I had chosen that it was not a violation of checks and balances, I probably would have, what would I have done? So let's say it's not a violation of checks and balances. I would say that, Fed 51 talks about branches restricting each other and not about the bureaucracy at all. I would potentially make my second paragraph all about the spoils system and how having people only fired for cause, for a reason, does prevent kind of a spoils system. It does prevent the president having almost too much power. So I would make a case for how this creates kind of more of a merit system, that someone's not getting removed from their position just because the president doesn't like them. So I would make that as my second point. My first point, using Fed 51, would be all about how this is maybe a check. This is Congress passing a law, and that's certainly within their power realm. And laws they pass can restrict the presidency. And I'd potentially even reference like the War Powers Act as an example of something else that is a law that restricts the presidency. And the president has the ability to check the Congress, but in the Constitution, there's no details about like checks and balances around bureaucracy. So I'd potentially make a case about that. There's a lot of different ways you could go if you wanted to choose that this wasn't a violation of checks and balances. You could talk about the executive. You could talk about the bureaucracy needing to be a meritocracy. You could talk about Fed 51 and the Constitution not outlining really any checks on bureaucracy, not seeing it as a major threat. You could argue that Congress has made other laws that restrict the president's powers, and that those are considered checks in a way. And then you could reference like the War Powers Act or the Impoundment Act. So those are probably three of the ways that I would potentially go. The other document involved was Fed 70. You could make a case that, hey, if you limit the president's powers, okay, this probably benefits my case, my choice of arguments. If you limit the president's powers in this way, they can't act quickly. They can't fire someone and replace them to make sure that that bureaucratic agency is working the right way. So Fed 70 kind of fits with the violation of checks and balances side. In fact, I'd probably go back and change this to Fed 70 now that I think about it. But I already wrote an essay that I think meets all the requirements here. Remember, you want to make connections as much as possible at the end of each of these paragraphs back to how this violates the principle of checks and balances. So make sure that you are, not only pointing out your evidence, but you're giving some reasoning that goes back to your claim. So make sure that you're hitting on that this is a violation of checks and balances, or it's not a violation of checks and balances. And if you have any questions about this FRQ, don't be afraid to ask. I think we got some clear points for either side. You have some sides for the violation of checks and balances, and you have some components that would go to the this is not a violation of checks and balances.